It was a cold night in 1773. The harbor of Boston was unusually quiet. Gentle waves touched the docks, and the ships rested silently under the dark sky. But beneath that silence, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would change the course of history forever. A group of men slowly moved toward the harbor. Their faces were serious and determined. Some of them had even disguised themselves, hiding their identities in the darkness. When they reached the ships, they climbed aboard quietly. Then something shocking happened. They began lifting large wooden chests filled with tea, and one by one they threw them into the sea. Splash after splash echoed across the harbor. This was not a simple protest. This was rebellion. And this moment would later become one of the most famous acts of defiance in history. But the real question is this: why were ordinary colonists so angry that they dared to challenge the most powerful empire in the world? To understand the answer, we must travel several years back in time. During the 18th century, Britain was one of the most powerful empires on Earth. Its navy ruled the seas, its trade networks stretched across continents, and its influence reached nearly every corner of the world. Among its most valuable possessions were the 13 American colonies. These colonies were located along the eastern coast of North America. Most of the people living there were settlers from Europe who had come seeking opportunity, freedom, and a better life. Over time, they built towns, farms, ports, and thriving communities. Trade flourished. Local governments were formed, and for many years, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies remained relatively peaceful. The colonists were proud to be part of the British Empire, but slowly, that relationship began to change. In 1754, a major conflict began between Britain and France. This war would later become known as the French and Indian War. The two European powers were competing for control of territory in North America. The war lasted nearly 9 years and spread across vast regions. Eventually, Britain emerged victorious, but victory came at a heavy price. The war had drained Britain's finances and left the empire buried under massive debt. Now the British government faced a serious problem. How could they pay for the war? Many leaders in Britain believed the answer was simple. The American colonies had benefited from British protection during the war, so they should help pay the costs. And so the British government decided to introduce new taxes in the colonies. This decision would ignite a fire that could not easily be extinguished. In 1765, the British Parliament passed a law known as the Stamp Act. According to this law, many printed materials in the colonies had to carry an official stamp purchased from the government. This included newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and even playing cards. For the first time, colonists were being directly taxed by the British government. The reaction was immediate. Colonists were furious. They asked a simple but powerful question: why should we pay taxes to a government where we have no representation? From this protest emerged a famous slogan that quickly spread across the colonies: no taxation without representation. These words became the rallying cry of resistance. The anger of the colonists began to grow. Across the colonies, protests erupted. Crowds gathered in the streets. Political leaders gave fiery speeches. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. In some places, the protests turned violent. British tax collectors were threatened, attacked, and forced to resign. Some colonists even formed secret groups to organize resistance. One of the most famous of these groups was called the Sons of Liberty. They operated in secret, planning protests and spreading revolutionary ideas. Their goal was clear: to challenge British authority in the colony. Eventually, the British government realized the Stamp Act had created enormous unrest. Facing pressure, Parliament decided to repeal the law. But the tension did not disappear. Instead, Britain introduced a new set of taxes called the Townshend Acts. These taxes applied to everyday items imported into the colonies, including glass, paper, paint, and tea. Once again, colonists were outraged. Boycotts resumed. Protests intensified. The relationship between Britain and the colonies grew increasingly hostile. And then in 1770, an event occurred that would shock the colonies and inflame public anger. On a cold evening in March 1770, tensions between colonists and British soldiers exploded in the streets of Boston. A crowd gathered and began shouting insults at a group of British troops. Snowballs, stones, and debris were thrown. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead on the ground. This tragic event became known as the Boston Massacre. News of the incident spread rapidly through the colonies. Newspapers printed dramatic illustrations of British soldiers firing into innocent crowds. The event became a powerful symbol of British oppression. Public anger reached new heights. After the Boston Massacre, tensions remained high. But for a few years, open conflict was avoided. On the surface, things seemed calm. Yet beneath that calm, a storm was quietly forming. Colonial leaders continued meeting secretly. They discussed strategy, unity, and the growing desire for independence. Ideas about freedom and self-government began spreading through pamphlets, speeches, and discussions in taverns and town halls. The spirit of resistance was slowly transforming into a movement. Then in 1773, the British government made another decision that would push the colonies closer to rebellion. In 1773, the British Parliament passed a new law known as the Tea Act. This law allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly in the American colonies. At first glance, the tea was actually cheaper than before, but colonists saw a hidden trap. They believed Britain was trying to trick them into accepting the controversial tea tax. If the colonists bought the tea, it would mean they had accepted Britain's right to tax them. And that was something many were unwilling to do. Anger spread once again, and soon resistance would take a dramatic and unforgettable form. December 1773. Late at night, a group of colonists disguised themselves as Native Americans. They quietly boarded ships anchored in Boston Harbor. Working swiftly, they broke open hundreds of chests filled with tea. Then they threw them into the dark waters below. More than 300 chests of tea were dumped into the harbor. This bold act became known as the Boston Tea Party. It was not simply a protest about tea. It was a direct challenge to British authority. The colonists had sent a clear message. They would no longer accept unfair control from across the ocean. But the British government would not ignore such defiance. In fact, the response from Britain would be harsh. And it would push the colonies closer to open war. A war that would soon transform a group of colonies into a new nation. And the world would never be the same again. The Boston Tea Party sent shockwaves across the British Empire. For Britain, this was not just a protest. It was a direct insult, a challenge to authority. And the British government was not known for ignoring challenges. Behind closed doors in London, anger filled the halls of power. Politicians debated fiercely. One question dominated every discussion. How do we punish the colonies and restore control? The answer would change everything. In 1774, the British Parliament passed a series of harsh laws. These laws were so strict, so severe, that the colonists later called them the Intolerable Acts. Their purpose was simple: to crush rebellion in America. But instead of breaking the colonists, these laws united them like never before. One of the first punishments was brutal. The port of Boston was shut down completely. No trade, no ships coming in, no goods going out. Boston's economy was suddenly strangled. Thousands of workers lost their jobs overnight. The British government also removed the colony's self-rule. Massachusetts was now under direct British military control. A British general became the new authority. To the colonists, this felt like occupation, not governance. Another law allowed British soldiers to be tried in Britain, not America if accused of crimes. This meant colonists believed British soldiers could do anything and never face justice. This created even more anger. British troops were also allowed to stay inside colonists' homes. Families were forced to house and feed soldiers. This was humiliating for many colonists. Trust completely collapsed. For years, the colonies had acted separately. Each colony had its own leadership, its own interests, its own problems. But now something unprecedented happened. The Intolerable Acts made them realize one thing. If Britain can punish one colony today, it can punish all tomorrow. So for the first time, the colonies began to unite. In 1774, leaders from different colonies gathered in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the First Continental Congress. It was not yet a declaration of independence, but it was a warning, a message to Britain. Among the leaders were men who would later become legends: George Washington, Samuel Adams, John Adams. They discussed a serious question. Should they resist Britain or obey? The Congress decided on a bold strategy: stop all trade with Britain. Colonists began boycotting British goods again. No tea, no imported clothing. no British products. The goal was economic pressure, to force Britain to back down. Meanwhile, in the colonies, tension was rising fast. British soldiers were everywhere. Weapons were being stored secretly in towns. Militias were forming. Farmers were training as soldiers. The situation was no longer just political. It was becoming military. British General Thomas Gage was stationed in Boston. He knew conflict was coming. He feared that colonists were preparing weapons and gunpowder in nearby towns. His orders were clear: disarm the rebels. But the colonists were also watching. Both sides were preparing for something inevitable: war. In April 1775, British troops marched quietly out of Boston. Their mission: capture colonial weapons stored in Concord. But word spread quickly. Paul Revere rode through the night warning the colonists. "The British are coming!" Militias gathered. Farmers picked up their rifles. They stood on the road between Lexington and Concord and waited. When British troops arrived at Lexington, they found armed colonists blocking their path. No one knows exactly who fired first, but a shot was fired. Then chaos followed. Smoke filled the air. The Revolutionary War had begun. British troops continued to Concord, but they were met with stronger resistance. Colonial militias attacked from forests, houses, and fields. They used guerrilla tactics: hiding, striking, disappearing. The British Army, trained for formal battlefield warfare, was shocked. As the British troops retreated back to Boston, they realized something terrifying. This was not a small protest. This was a full-scale uprising, and it was spreading fast. Across the colonies, more militias were forming. More weapons were being gathered, and more people were choosing sides. By mid-1775, it was clear. The relationship between Britain and the colonies had collapsed. There was no going back. Diplomacy had failed. Protest had failed. Punishments had failed. Only one path remained: war. And this war would soon become one of the most important conflicts in history. The American Revolutionary War had officially begun. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, everything changed. The conflict was no longer hidden. It was no longer political. It was now a full-scale war between Britain and its colonies, and both sides knew there was no turning back. In 1775, colonial militias surrounded the city of Boston. British troops were trapped inside. The city became a battlefield of tension. Every road, every hill, every movement was watched carefully. The British Army, once considered unstoppable, was now under pressure. For the first time, they were being challenged on their own ground. The colonies now faced a serious problem. They had brave fighters. They had passion. They had anger. But they did not have a unified army. Each colony was fighting in its own way. They needed leadership. They needed discipline. They needed a commander who could turn chaos into an army. In 1775, the Continental Congress made a historic decision. They chose a man from Virginia to lead their forces. His name was George Washington, a tall, calm, and disciplined leader. Unlike many others, he did not seek fame or power. He sought order. He understood that winning against Britain would require more than courage. It would require strategy. Under Washington's leadership, the colonial forces were officially united into one army, the Continental Army. But it was far from perfect. The soldiers were farmers, blacksmiths, and ordinary citizens. They had little training, few weapons, and even less experience. Still, they had something powerful: a belief in freedom. Meanwhile, Britain prepared for a massive war. They sent thousands of professional soldiers across the Atlantic, well-trained, well-equipped, experienced in global warfare. On paper, Britain had every advantage. They believed the rebellion would end quickly. They believed the colonies would surrender. They were wrong. In June 1775, one of the first major battles took place near Boston. It became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Colonial forces took position on high ground. They waited silently. British troops marched forward confidently. But as they advanced, colonial fighters opened fire. The battle was fierce. Smoke filled the sky. Chaos spread across the hill. The British eventually captured the hill, but victory came at a heavy price. They suffered heavy casualties, far more than they expected. This shocked British commanders. For the first time, they realized this would not be an easy war. News of the battle spread quickly across the colonies. People were inspired. They saw that British soldiers could be defeated. Hope began to grow. More volunteers joined the Continental Army. The revolution was no longer just an idea. It was becoming a reality. As the war intensified, a new thought began spreading. At first, the colonists were not fighting for independence. They were fighting for rights, for fairness, for representation. But now something was changing. People began asking a bold question. Why are we still part of Britain at all? This question would soon change everything. Inside the colonies, opinions were divided. Some still wanted peace with Britain. They believed reconciliation was possible. Others believed independence was the only path forward. Tension grew not just between America and Britain, but within the colonies themselves. George Washington faced enormous challenges. His army lacked supplies. Soldiers often went unpaid. Desertions were common. Winter made conditions worse. Yet he refused to give up. He believed endurance would win where strength could not. As the war continued, other nations began watching closely. France, Spain, and others saw an opportunity. If Britain was weakened, the global balance of power could change. Secretly, some countries began considering support for the colonies. The war was no longer just local. It was becoming international. By late 1775, both sides knew the war was far from over. The British expected a final victory. The colonists were still building their strength. But something important was happening beneath the surface. A belief was forming, a belief that would soon be written into history. The belief that freedom was worth fighting for at any cost. And as winter approached, the war was about to enter a new phase. A phase where ideas would become declarations, and colonies would begin transforming into a nation. By 1776, the war had reached a critical point. The colonies had fought bravely. They had suffered losses. They had endured hardship. But one question now stood above all others. What exactly were they fighting for? Freedom or something greater? At first, the conflict was not about independence. It was about rights, representation, fair treatment. But over time, something powerful began to change. People started realizing, you cannot fix a system that refuses to change. The idea of complete independence began to spread like fire. A powerful voice emerged during this time, a writer named Thomas Paine. He wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. In simple words, he asked a bold question. Why should a small island rule a vast continent? His words spread rapidly across the colonies. Farmers read it, soldiers read it, leaders read it, and minds began to change. In 1776, colonial leaders gathered once again in Philadelphia. Tension filled the room. The decision they were about to make was irreversible. Either remain under British rule or declare independence forever. After long debates, the decision was made. A young leader named Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write a historic document. This document would become known as the Declaration of Independence. It was more than just words. It was a statement of identity, a break from the past, a promise of a new future. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration was officially adopted. The colonies declared themselves free from British rule. They were no longer colonies. They were now United States. A new nation was born. The Declaration stated powerful ideas, that all men are created equal, that they have rights to life, liberty, and happiness, that governments exist only with the consent of the governed. These ideas would change the world forever. When news reached Britain, the reaction was harsh. The British Empire did not accept the Declaration. To them, it was rebellion. To them, it was betrayal. The war intensified even further. Now it was no longer about control. It was about survival. Even after independence was declared, the fighting did not stop. In fact, some of the hardest battles were still ahead. The Continental Army continued struggling against a powerful British military. But something had changed. They were no longer just fighting soldiers. They were fighting for a nation that now existed in principle. As the war progressed, international support began to shift. France eventually decided to support the American cause. This was a turning point, because now Britain was no longer fighting alone against colonies, but against a growing global alliance. Years of war followed. Both sides suffered. Both sides endured. But slowly, the balance began to shift. The colonies became stronger. The British position weakened. The dream of independence moved closer to reality. Finally, after years of conflict, Britain accepted that the war could not be easily won. Negotiations began. Peace talks started, and the future of America began to take shape. The war that began with protests, taxes, and tea ended with the birth of a nation. The United States of America had emerged, not through comfort, but through struggle, not through peace, but through sacrifice. The American Revolution was more than a war. It was a transformation. It showed that ideas can be stronger than empires, that ordinary people can challenge powerful rulers, and that the desire for freedom can change history forever. From a quiet harbor in Boston to the Declaration of Independence, a new nation was born, and the world would never be the same again.